Okay, so House of the Dragon episode 8 is now out, and the brand new entry is currently upping the ante like Jon Snow in season 7. It's a big family affair, with the sides metaphorically burning down the house.
Dracarys!
There's a lot to unpack from this one, and throughout the video we're going to be recapping the plot, pointing out all the Easter eggs, and talking about how it differs from the book Fire and Blood. Now the entry combines several years from the timeline in order to tell its story. The two major events in it are the death of Vaemond, which is later followed by King Viserys, who sadly passes away at the end of the entry. In the books, the first of these happened in 126 AC, with the latter happening 3 years later in 129. Therefore, they've kinda combined several events into this hour-long episode, and according to the creative team, this will be the last time jump in the series. From here on out, we'll be travelling into the Dance of the Dragons, which is described as being the far more elegant name for the civil war amongst the Targaryens. This was foreshadowed all the way back in episode 1 with this line from an elderly Rhaenyra.
The only thing that could tear down the House of the Dragon was itself.
Now the episode is titled Lord of the Tides, which is a title traditionally held by the House of Velaryon. The people who gain this instantly get the island of Driftmark, along with the naval powers of Blackwater Bay. This also typically makes them the master of ships on the council, and it's a heavily sought after position. Most of this episode centers around one single paragraph in the book that talks about Vaemond claiming to be Lord of the Tides and then getting beheaded before he's fed to Syrax. We open the episode with a shot behind the throne, teasing at who's sitting in it. Over the top of this, we can hear Rhaenys asking about the state of her husband, who has been mortally wounded in battle. This is a change up from the books, as in that it describes him as just being struck with a sudden fever. This happens after the battle, but there's no mention of any fighting happening in the source material. The work describes how he was surrounded by maesters, and due to his ill health, the question of succession came into play. Now though I've mentioned 129 AC a lot, I think this is more likely taking place in 126 due to this line by Rhaenys.
It's been near 6 years since I last saw my lord husband, Maester.
We know last episode was 120 AC, and therefore the 6-year gap could be telling us that it's 126. At this point, Vaemond ends up stepping forward in order to try and seize the position of the heir. This is of course meant to mirror Daemon, the brother of Viserys, who too sought to become the ruler until this was stripped from his hands. Even the name Daemon and Vaemond sound similar, but whereas D-Dog was told to head off, Vaemond is told to head off. Now he talks about how Corlys only cares about the history books, and this mirrors the scene from last week in which he talked about how names were more important than blood. This ambition is what drives him, and he ends up losing out in the Game of Thrones due to trying to oust the Strongs. Viserys has been appointed as the heir of Driftmark, and though you might automatically think that it would pass to Jacaerys, he's the one who's inheriting the title of the Iron Throne. We've seen something similar recently after the passing of Queen Elizabeth, and her son Charles ended up becoming the king. His title of Prince of Wales was then taken away and given to his son Prince William. It's a similar situation in Westeros, where you can only really have one title at once, and this is why he goes to Luke instead of his brother Jace. After he mentions the Strongs, Rhaenys says this line.
My cousin the king would have your tongue for this.
Something like this happened in the books, and after Vaemond was killed, his cousins went to Viserys to try and demand justice. They knelt before him, detailing how his grandchildren were Strongs, and Viz sat there in silence waiting for them to finish. Once they did, he ordered for their tongues to be cut out, because Viz in the books is a complete savage. I have talked about this a lot in past breakdowns, and though there's teasers towards him wanting to do this, they cut to the chase with one of the biggest shock moments in Game of Thrones history. We've also already had a similar scene with Larys basically doing the same thing with his assassin, and therefore I can see why they skipped over it. Rhaenys being the one on the throne also somewhat mirrors the fact that Vaemond says Alicent is actually the one who sits on the Iron Throne these days. We'll get into this more in just a bit, but the killing of Lionel Strong has allowed her to take control of almost everything, with her father being the Han and she being the Queen. The book talks about how Viserys' interest in being near the throne started to disappear as the BS started to mount up. Man just wanted to finish building the title sequence on his train set, and thus it says he rarely attended court. It's also important to bear in mind that the book describes him as being very short of breath during this time, and thus he was often carried through the kingdom on one of his royal chairs. In the book, he didn't lose his fingers until after the thing with Vaemond, and it's said that after this that he never sat on the throne again. Though he returns to the throne room in this entry, he's a shell of his former self, looking like Gus Fring after that bell rings, and I think the eye missing is symbolic for a number of reasons. Aemon of course lost his, and Viserys refused to act on it, which caused Alicent to hate that side of the family even more. In the end, he rocks a mask that looks like the same thing Crabfeeder had on, and this was actually a repurposed one from the Sons of the Harpy. The mask wasn't present in the book, and we'll talk about how his death is described in that, as it differs slightly from what happens with Gollum. Now, I tweeted earlier in the week that if you bought the Funko for him, you had to keep putting it in the microwave after every episode to keep it up to date. However, even with that in mind, I was completely shocked with how bad he looks. Now, this video is sponsored by Established Titles, a gift that lets you become like your favourite lord or lady in House of the Dragon. Did you know there's a traditional Scottish custom to have landowners referred to as a lord, lady, or a laird? That's why I was super interested in this project, which allows you to get at least 1 square foot of dedicated land in Edelston, Scotland. It's also a great way to help out the environment, as Established Titles will plant 1 tree with every single order. They work with charities like One Tree Planet and Trees for the Future to help with reforestation efforts. So if you pick up a plot, you can refer to yourself as a lord whilst helping to preserve the picturesque woodlands of Scotland. Now, there also comes a bit of an ego boost on top of all this environmental stuff. Because you're now a lord, laird, or a lady, you can officially change your name on things like credit cards, plane tickets, your dating profile, whatever you want to do. As you can see here, they give you an official certificate, and it also details the exact location of your unique plot number. On top of this, Established Titles have also told me that the first 200 people who use my link below will be placed within walking distance from my plot. Depending on how many of you want to become a lord, lady, or laird, we can build our unique heavy spoilerdom kingdom together. You can be like Lord Kevin Spoilers, you punk. I'll see you, chump. Established Titles is actually running a massive early Black Friday sale right now. Plus, if you use the code Heavy Spoilers, you get an additional 10% off. Go to establishedtitles.com/heavy spoilers to get your gift and help support the channel. Makes for a great last minute gift. You can get yourself involved in all the House of the Dragons drama, so definitely go check it out in the description below. Thanks. Anyway, after Driftmark we cut to Dragonstone, which has several parts of its castle that look like the jaws of a dragon. Smoke surrounds the cave, and we catch Daemon as part of the billionaire spelunking crowd looking at Syrax's eggs. Last week they lost his ex-wife's dragon Vhagar, and now they're desperate to get something to help even the playing field. These clutches of eggs are described in the book as being laid in 118 AC, which is the same year in which Rhaenyra betroths her 2 strongest boys, Talaena and Baela. Didn't mean anything by calling them strong boys here. Now, this happens in the episode, but it's more of a play to keep the kingdom as her sons, rather than doing it for the sake of doing it like it's in the book. The episode also introduces the 2 kids that Daemon and Rhaenyra have together, in Aegon the Younger and also Viserys. Rhaenyra also appears to be pregnant in this entry, hinting at the next one coming along the way, who I'll talk more about in the spoiler section. The slow decline of Rhaenyra in the books is also a big thing that the show has kind of glossed over, and they may start to delve into this more in the following episodes. In the opening of the chapter, she's described as being the realm's delight. However, as the story goes on, it says she gets uglier and fatter due to a number of reasons. The first is that she has 5 kids in a couple of years, but beyond that there's also the constant stress that being the heir brings. Though Alicent is often depicted as the bad guy, it also has moments that talk about how Rhaenyra grew bitter over her because she retained her figure. Now, the text also brings up how Alicent took the baby being called Aegon as a slight to her, and even though Rhaenyra denied this, she did do it on purpose. It says, in King's Landing, however, Queen Alicent grew most wroth when she learned the babe had been named Aegon, taking that for a slight against her own son Aegon, which, according to the testimony of Mushroom, it most certainly was. Aegon the Conqueror is of course a major person in the Targaryen lineage, who took them to the point that they ruled 6 of the 7 kingdoms. His name being brought forward was very important, with them even getting to the point now that they're fighting over who should carry it. Baela sends a message to her father about what Vaemond is trying to do, and we cut to Rhaenyra, who goes to her recast sons. We see Jacaerys practicing his High Valyrian in front of a great table, which is the same one that popped up in Game of Thrones. There's also Joffrey in the background, who looks about 6ish, again supporting this being 126 AC. They decide to go to King's Landing, which we can see still has scaffolding on it due to it being under construction. This was shown in episode 1, and obviously they want to show it's being worked on, with this being a prequel series. They're greeted by Lord Caswell, who you might remember as being the person on the stairs when Rhaenyra had to bring Joffrey up. He's one of the only loyal supporters left to Rhaenyra, and this actually ends up having repercussions for the character that we'll see as we head off into the future episodes, and that's a little in-joke for my peeps who've read the book. Now they come in to see a big symbol of the Faith of the Seven, which is shot to dwarf them in one of its tiny markings. We get a follow-up of this in the next scene, and see that it hangs above the council, looking over every decision. You might also notice that Alicent is wearing a Faith of the Seven necklace throughout most of the episode. This is the most dominant religion in Westeros, and it was brought to the Seven Kingdoms by the Andals thousands of years before the series takes place. It tends to dominate the Southlands of Westeros, with the region being dedicated to the quote-unquote new gods. However, up north, the people tend to worship the old gods of the forest, and those in Driftmark look to the Marlin King. However, this religion has a great foothold in the realm, and the fact that Alicent is now deeply involved with this shows how she could be weaponizing the church. She could be doing this for genuine reasons though, as she of course prayed alongside Rhaenyra all the way back in episode 2. Eventually, the church did start to fall apart, and this happened after Cersei showed them a Lannister always pays their debts. It was a shame what happened to them, and it's going to be interesting to see how they're woven into this series. Now during this time, it's also important to bear in mind that Grand Maester Mellos died. He collapsed one night whilst climbing the Serpentine steps, and unfortunately he didn't recover. He did work closely with Viserys, and I was wondering if they tied him with that, but unfortunately he's never really brought up. The source material talks about how both Rhaenyra and Alicent tried to appoint their own maesters, and they were basically trying to stuff the council with people that would end up working in their favour. However, it was the Citadel that always decided this, and they appointed Archmaester Orwell, who we see in this episode. Lord Beesbury also gets Beesbury-littled.
Thank you for that exhaustive accounting, Lord Beesbury, I remind you.
Now this likely sets up what's going to happen with him next week, which involves some silencing that I won't spoil too much. At this point we visit Viserys to see him rotting away alone, whilst the realm runs on without him. I think his mind has been on the decline too, and this is why he called Alicent Emma last week before he went to bed.
I'm going to bed, Emma.
This plays into the end with his incoherent ramblings being misinterpreted by the Queen as he lays on his deathbed. Guy is in a sorry state, and this scene struck a chord with me quite a lot. I've had a couple of people in my life that have visited on their deathbed, and they came across like this. It brought back a lot of painful memories that I think give this scene a lot of impact for me. Now Daemon isn't really there to comfort him, and instead he wants Lucerys affirmed by the king. However, Rhaenyra interrupts this because she's seemingly the only one that still cares about Viz. The new kids are brought in, but they start crying, and at this point Viserys asks for his drink, which we later learn is milk of the poppy. If you cast your mind back to the ending of episode 6, then you might remember that Laenor brought up how Rhaenyra suspected that Alicent might poison his tea if they were to leave. Daemon actually ends up sniffing the cup too, clearly suspicious that this contains something that's slowly killing him. Now in the book, there are two trains of thought on how Viserys passed away, with there even being potential foul play involved. We often have to dive into these when discussing the source material because there's so many accounts over what really happened. There are some that say that he passed away in his sleep, whereas others say that Alicent poisoned him. However, the series keeps things more straightforward, with it being revealed that he genuinely did die of natural causes. The series has pinned this on the leprosy that's slowly been developing, whereas in the book he suffered from several fevers and shortness of breath. Now from here we cut to what I think's the darkest scene in the episode, with one of the servants who's been R-worded by Aegon. Obviously it's a really sensitive subject and YouTube tend to restrict videos that talk about this, but it just goes to show the monster that Alicent wants on the throne. She clearly doesn't care about what's best for the realm and just wants to make sure her children are in charge. She seemingly comforts the girl and says that she believes her, but in reality she's manipulating her into staying silent. We had some talk in the Kevin Spoiler's office about how she might be poisoning her, but I think it's more straightforward than that, with this being likely the planned tea that Rhaenyra was given earlier in the season. The books go in depth on Aegon during this time, and though we don't see them in the episode, at this point in the original story, Aegon and his sister Helaena had twins and an older child in Maelor. Helaena does come in and say this.
Have you seen Diana? She's supposed to dress the children.
So I do think they're out there, we just don't meet them. Now this happened when Helaena was 14, and they were called Jaehaerys and Jaehaera, with Aegon constantly bragging about how he'd had 2 heirs of his own. It's said that the children had a lot of things off with them though, and this is likely due to the constant inbreeding that exists within the Targaryens. Now we have talked about this before in relation to the German royal family, who ended up having something known as the Habsburg jaw. After generations of incest, it caused it to protrude more and more and more, and they ended up looking like Jimmy Hill with Rick James's haircut. Now Jaehaera didn't cry, smile, or do anything that babies typically did, and Jaehaerys was born with 6 fingers and toes. The book says, "A wife and children did little to curb the carnal appetites of Prince Aegon the Elder. If Mushroom is to be believed, he fathered 2 bastard children the same year as the twins, a boy on a girl whose maidenhead he won at an auction on the Street of Silk, and a girl by one of his mother's maidservants. The tea might not even work properly, and potentially the child could come into play down the line. Either way, Aegon doesn't think he's done anything wrong, but he also clearly isn't interested in leading. I do wonder if they're going to do the compromising situation that they find him in next week, but his lust for women is something that's constantly brought up in the source material. Cut to Rhaenyra and Daemon, and I love the design of her dress. She has a passion for fashion, and I think the way the red and black are infused together, almost with a dragon tail at the top, looks really good. We also catch her staring at the cut on her wrist, and see that it's now turned into a scar. Daemon brings up the king's wisdom, and how, though they say they're leading with that, he's clearly completely incoherent. Alicent's ignorance over this speaks to why she doesn't question his final words, and we learn that the kingdom has also had all its Targaryen iconography stripped out so that the Faith of the Seven can be put in its place. She's drank the Kool-Aid, and now believes that a higher power is guiding her, so even if she has to do things, she can lay the blame elsewhere. Cut to the courtyard to see the Strongs returning in a scene that echoes the one that appeared in episode 6. They're both getting stared at, and look, I know white people with dreadlocks can be a bit, you know, but hey, maybe you guys could try. No, never mind. Anyway, in the court, we catch as Aemon and Criston Cole battle it out in an intense sparring match with the former getting the upper hand. The book says that, despite the loss of his eye, that he became a proficient swordsman solely because of Criston, and man is about to become the most badass character in the show. It also notes that he's unforgiving, and this ties into the grudge that he still bears over the loss of his eye. Now, I said this in our trailer breakdown, but Aemon is in full gangster mode right now, looking like a cross between Liquid Snake and Big Boss. Jace and Luke are clearly out of their depth, and it really hammers home how much of an asset to Alicent that Aemon is. Now, a character that we don't meet in this episode is her son Daeron. This was another one of Alicent's children who was born during this time, and he was supposed to be 12 by the year 126 AC. The book says he was the most popular of the Queen's son due to being clever and courteous, however sadly we don't get to meet him here. Now, the reason he might not show up in the series is probably one of two things. Firstly, we have way too many characters at this point to keep introducing every week, and therefore they probably just wanted to keep things simple. He was also sent to Old Town when he was a child, and he served as a cupbearer to Lord Hightower for several years, so that gives them a reason to not include the character. Now at this point, Vaemond is brought in, and in another detail that shows the Hightowers have taken over, we can see the knights are wearing their symbol on their chest piece. The beacon at the top is burning with a green flame, again tying back to how they've declared war. He goes to Alicent and Otto in order to make a deal, and over at the Weirwood Tree, we see Rhaenyra doing the same thing. Rhaenys of course inspired her name, and she married her son in order to keep up appearances. However, she knows it was all a charade, and that the kids aren't true Valyrians. Rhaenyra plays to this need to have her grandchildren on the throne, and offers a betrothal. And hey, to be fair, you could do with some extra blood, cause the gene pool is looking pretty shallow. And in the end, she allows it to happen, and it offers a win for Rhaenyra, who secures Driftmark to her side. That night, Rhaenyra goes to her father's bed, and he mistakes her for someone else, foreshadowing the mistaken identity at the end. She brings up the Song of Ice and Fire, which further plants the idea in his head that he has to talk about it in the final scene. Cut to the morning with a strong focus on the model that's now covered in cobwebs, which carries a lot of symbolism. In a scene that mirrors the one from episode 1, we see Viserys' wounds are now being tended to, but that they now run over his entire body. The effect work they do here is incredible, and we see him as a withered old Mr. Burns man who has to be heavily sedated so he doesn't succumb to his pain. The Faith of the Seven sigil also shines down on him, and Otto is told to arrange a supper for the family. In the throne room, the claims are considered, and I'm pretty sure in the book that Vaemond did the bastard speech back at Driftmark away from the court. The way it reads in the text is that they heard about the comments made by him, and then Daemon was dispatched there. As mentioned earlier, the book has him being fed to Syrax, and then his cousins went to the kingdom where they had their tongues removed. Here though, his body is returned to Driftmark after it's prepared by the Silent Sisters. These are members of the Faith of the Seven, and their job is to dress bodies for funerals. As we've seen in the series, every house has their own way of doing things. The Targaryens burn the bodies, whereas the Valyrians send them out to sea. Either way, it's way more impactful seeing how it plays out here, and Daemon even drops a very tongue-in-cheek pun after making the guy look like Terence and Philip. Viserys returns to the throne to see the claim himself, and upon this happening, Otto immediately steps out of it. He clearly sat in it believing that he could take control of this hearing, but Viserys battles his way up to the chair in order to deliver judgment. It's a highly impactful scene that's one of his last deeds to ensure his daughter's safety. It of course mirrors the entrance made by Alicent at the wedding, and in the end he's helped up by his brother Daemon, who previously pushed him away. A tear, A little tear might have rolled down my face, and what a brilliant way to show us the return of the king. Rhaenys backs up the claim, and I tell you what, I loved seeing the look on Otto and Alicent's face. F you! Fuck off! Now Aegon smirks, and again, this is because he's reluctant to be forced into a position of leadership. Vaemond can't take the decision though, so my man's gotta become a Pez dispenser. Can't show this as I don't want to get demonetized, and I probably also can't show Viserys' missing eye, so bear that in mind for later in the breakdown. Also, I was going to do a Vision pun, but I'll skip that. Now, my man Viz kinda wishes he'd not bothered going back there. And hey mate, I tell you, just let the guy play with his train set. Just please one day just give me a flashback series that's just Viserys having a good time. Now that night they have a supper, and this is described in great detail in the book. In the book, this was all basically a show put on to impress the king, and in the work, they wear their opposite houses' colours in a show of good faith. For example, Rhaenyra wore green, whilst Alicent donned the classic red and black. This is something she also wore back when Daemon returned to King's Landing, but since then, her dresses have gone on a colour journey. Episode 1 had her wearing a very light blue dress, which over the episodes slowly changed in the dark green like how it is now. The story says that declarations of love were made, and both Otto and Daemon even saluted each other. The former said the prince was very courageous, whilst Daemon thanked him for his leal service as the Hand of the King. It said that Viserys was really happy with this, and that he went to bed smiling. However, after this, it ended up looking like an episode of Jerry Springer with her family all falling out. The book has this event recounted by Mushroom, who says that Aemond One Eye rose up to toast his nephews, and he said, "I've never known someone so strong as my sweet nephews." Bit out of line that, but he might be being genuine, and this was then followed up by his speech saying, "So let us drain our cups to these 3 strong boys." Jacaerys was also said to have asked Helaena for her dance, and both of these events end up happening in the episode. The entire thing here is meant to be a celebration of the houses being brought together. I've just realised I haven't asked you to unite our houses by subscribing to the channel. If you enjoy the video then please do, and don't forget to hit the thumbs up button. Cheers. Now Viserys tries to unite the families one final time, and it actually goes down well with Alicent and Rhaenyra, who realise they have more in common than they don't. However, they've poisoned their kids to the point there's no coming back. Helaena also says something here that I can't quite make out.
Beware the beast beneath the boards.
Well done, my boy.
As I'm sure many of you know, we get sent these episodes early by HBO, but unfortunately we don't get closed captions for them, so I can't quite understand this line. Let me know below, and as we've discussed on other videos, this could be hinting to one of their fates. She did talk about Aemond closing an eye to get a dragon, and also predicted the marriage of Daemon and Rhaenyra in the last entry. Sounds like Beast Beneath the Borders, but yeah, let me know below exactly what it is, because you'll know by now. Now Aegon is brought down by Helaena, and then Jace asking her to dance takes things too far, especially because it's one of those weird hop dances.
It's just a jump to the left.
Now it looks like everything's going to be okay though, and similar to the source material, Viserys goes back to bed thinking it's all coming up Millhouse. Luke ends up causing Aemond to rise after laughing at him, and this strong speech all kicks off. Really shows how clever George R.R. Martin was by making the surname something you can use as a compliment, but here it's belittling others and it shows the balls that Aemond has. He has a stare off against Daemon, and I love the way that they're laying the seeds between these two for what's coming down the line. Similar to Vaemond, Aemond sounds similar to Daemon, and both are the brothers of people that others hold up as their king. Rhaenyra says she's going back to Dragonstone and that she'll return, but we'll talk later on about what happens in this case. That night we see Mysaria hearing something from an informant in the castle, and how this will play out, I'm not even sure. It could, however, be playing into the characters of Blood and Cheese, who might be brought up next week, and I'm sure if you read the book, you'll be familiar with who they are. It might be about the maid and potentially one of Aegon's kids, but yeah, let me know below what you think. Cut to Viserys on his deathbed, and in his ramblings he talks about the prince who was promised. Rhaenyra asked him earlier in the episode if he believed it was true, and here he answers by saying that he does. However, due to the name in the prophecy being Aegon, Alicent misinterprets this as him saying that their son should rule. The prince who was promised prophecy was of course passed on from king to king and king to queen, and thus Alicent would never have been told this. So we can see how things can be lost like this and misinterpreted down the line. He says, "You are the one," and Jon Snow did come from Rhaenyra's bloodline, tying back into this. We've already dropped a full breakdown on how last episode actually makes this all make sense, and how the blood on the blade carries an extra symbolic meaning to it. Alicent, however, thinks it's Viserys' last wish to make Aegon the rightful heir, and this will set up why she wants to fight for him on the throne. We get Viz reaching out, almost like someone is above him, and he utters this as his final words. Now, the series plays things slightly differently to the book, in that Helena brought her kids up to Viz, who explained the story of how they got their names. He let one play with his pearl ring, and talked about how King Jaehaerys rode with his dragon to the wall in order to defeat invaders. The work says, though the children had heard the story a dozen times before, they listened attentively. Afterwards, the king sent them away, pleading his weariness and a tightness in his chest. Then Viserys, House of Targaryen, the first of his name, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, and Protector of the Realm, closed his eyes and went to sleep. He never woke, he was 52 years old, and had reigned over most of Westeros for 26 years. The chapter then ends with the ominous line, "Then the storm broke, and the dragons danced." Now that concludes the episode, and it was another bloody banger. I'm absolutely in love with this series, and for me, it gets better every week. They really bring the book to life and do way more with it than I'd ever even expected. Next week is going to kick off too, and for the next part of the video, we're going to get into the spoilers. If you don't want to know, then thanks for sitting through the video, and please hit the thumbs up on your way out. Now, Viserys' body is discovered by his servant, who quickly tells the Queen, but rather than reporting it to the rest of the realm, she rushes to the council to secure Aegon will be the king. They refuse to tell Rhaenyra, and she goes into labour. Eventually, she learns that they've made Aegon the king whilst this is going on, and it causes a lot of stress. The birth is an arduous process and an extremely painful one in which the child is stillborn. It apparently has a dragon's tail, and Rhaenyra blames Alicent for not only killing her child, but also for taking the throne. She even calls the baby a monster at one point, which we might see in the episode. It all kicks off in the realm, with some staying loyal to Rhaenyra, including Lord Beesbury. We don't know what happens with him, as some accounts say he's locked in a dungeon, whilst others say that he's murdered on the spot. All gonna kick off, and I hope to see you back for it next week. Obviously, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so make sure you let me know in the comments below. We are in a competition right now and giving away 3 copies of Thor Love and Thunder on the 15th of October, and all you have to do to be on the chance of winning is like the video, make sure you subscribe with notifications on, and drop a comment below with your thoughts on the episode. We pick the comments at random at the end of the month, and the winners of the last one are on screen right now, so if that's you, then message me on Twitter at HeavySpoilers. If you want something else to watch, then make sure you check out our breakdown of Rings of Power, which will be linked on screen right now. You've gone over the entire thing, and it's definitely worth checking out if you want to know more about that show. Now with that out of the way, thanks for sitting through the video. I've been Paul, and I'll see you next time. Take care, peace.